Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness, and Donovon Jenson is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are going to be talking about how are pleasure and happiness related. They might be interchangeable for some people, or they might be completely different things for others. So, Donovan, what is your initial take when it comes to pleasure and happiness?
Yeah, so for me, the first thing that comes to mind is sort of pleasure generally is a little bit more of like a visceral or a physical sort of feeling,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then for me, happiness falls a little bit more in to buckets that are like along the lines of more either like logical or emotional, and it kind of depends on the definitions that you use as an individual. And I guess the reason that the way that I've just broken it down is like sort of murky is because people talk about happiness specifically in multiple ways, but now as I'm talking about it, pleasure too, right? Sometimes people sort of talk about it in ways that are a little bit mixed, because you can have something like massage that is like I would guess most people find pleasurable if it's a good one.
Yeah, true.
But there's also other things that like other turns of phrase like it gives me great pleasure to introduce this person. So the more I think about it, the more like the way it is actually that both words are used can be a little bit murky, but I do think there is a distinction, even if I haven't been able to articulate like that line well at this moment. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with your initial take that like the first thoughts that come into mind when I hear pleasure are more physical sensations. Like it could be sight or touch or smell or I mean, usually the first thing that popped in my head was sexuality, essentially pleasure, sex, intimacy kind of fall in that bucket. But then I was also thinking of like food. Food. The experience of tasting food is very pleasurable. And I don't know. I think there's some foods I'd say make me happy, but then there's others that are like a pleasurable experience, almost not necessarily like a sexual experience, but almost like that. Ooh, yeah. Pleasurable, like I don't know if I can really distinguish or how I'm going to describe this really. But yeah, that's my initial take.
Yeah, it brings me back to sort of like it's I'm still kind of hung up on the phrasing piece of it, right? Where like you
Right.
ask people. So for example, since I just traveled, they ask you if you're traveling for business or pleasure, right? And so like it'd be a little bit weird to ask if you're traveling like for work or for like physically pleasant sensation. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
we have to have
that's a good point.
the definition is probably a little bit broader, but still like you don't ask people, you ask people, you might ask people if they're happy, but you wouldn't ask them like, do you have pleasure, or like do you experience, like that's a weird question to try to like figure out how someone feels.
Right.
So I'm still trying to I think pleasure might be something more along the lines of the what like the desirability of an experience itself. So by that I mean like how nice something is or feels or whatever else. And I almost feel like happiness is more of your relationship or your evaluation or the way that you like interpret those events or things that are happening to you. Getting into territory I haven't thought about a lot and feels more and more nuanced as I talk about it. But it seems like pleasure is like more like, because you can have things that were pleasurable that you don't take happiness in, which is kind of interesting when I started thinking about that. But like, for example, a lot of those things, a lot of those same things, there are certain foods that provide pleasure for like the moments they're in my mouth, but I'm unhappy with myself for having eaten them, or like if it's in excess, right?
Oh,
Those
good.
sorts of things. So as I talk about it more, I feel like for me, it's more of like there's sort of this distinction between the quality of the experience itself, or like the desirability of the individual sort of like experiences or ideas or whatever else. And for happiness, something more along the lines of like how I interpret or interact with or perceive and process those events in a broader scope, as opposed to just simply like the baseline quality of the experience.
Yeah. No, I kind of agree with that line of logic. That makes sense. Yeah, and I think I was just thinking of how pleasurable is sort of more experiential, but at the same time, happiness can be too. And then I was also thinking happiness is more like your mood and your attitude, but then people could say they're in a pleasant mood. So I'm like, oh, this is really getting harder to tease out because they can overlap in a lot of respect.
Yeah, I will say, I think for me at least, and we can see how this lands for you. But
Yeah,
for me at least, happiness is definitely a broader term or word,
yeah,
right? There are more
I
things that
agree.
fall under the umbrella of
Yeah.
happiness, and I feel like um pleasure is sort of one of the components that, I guess, it's not necessary for happiness. You can actually have a very unpleasant life and still find a way to be happy. However, it is much, much easier to be happy, I think, for the vast majority of people,
Mhm,
if they are experiencing pleasure in some form or to some degree on a regular basis.
mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think when you were going back to what you were saying before about being asked if this trip is for business or pleasure, I guess the other interchangeable word that can go with pleasure is, in that context, is leisure. um, in that sense, because yeah, it would be very odd for someone who's like checking you in or at the airport to say, are you traveling for business or for your own personal happiness or something? Which, I mean, you could still be traveling and you could still be happy, even if it is related to business. But leisure, pleasure kind of is a different ballpark.
And maybe that's one of the big pieces that's missing in
Mm-hmm.
between happiness and pleasure, right? Is happiness, to me at least, seems to carry with it the weight of having a sense of like purpose or connectedness to things,
Mm-hmm.
whereas pleasure doesn't necessarily, right? Like, I feel like I could do a lot of things that are very pleasurable, but then on reflection be like, well, the experiences were valuable, I guess, in what they were, but not in any broader context. Massage, I'll go back to, for example, right? Like, getting a massage is nice and feels nice,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't necessarily provide any sense of purpose or connectedness.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like you could really work hard to create an example where it does, but I guess I wouldn't be able to look back on, okay, here are the things that I did with my life.
Yeah.
I just got massages and like ate really good food,
Mm-hmm.
and I never really like connected with anyone or had any relationships or worked on any like projects that I found valuable, or I never pushed forward on any skills for myself or anything like that. And I feel like, at least for me, one of the big things that happiness encompasses is having some sort of purpose or sense of doing something with meaning. I guess meaning is another word.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas pleasure, um, for me at least, in my definitions and most of the ways I've seen it, it's not often related to that. Now, I will also say that some people get pleasure in doing things that are meaningful, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not the pleasure itself that provides any sort of like value or purpose.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I see. I can see where you're coming from. Although my initial thought was when you're using massage as an example with regards to like meaning and purpose, I was like, well, I mean, for me, the purpose is self-care and taking time to relax and have some downtime and take care of me for a change, given that I'm always taking care of other people. But I get where you were going with like the greater purpose of of it having like connectedness and meaning and driving my life forward. I mean, technically it can, by giving myself a moment to rest and recover is a way to propel me forward. But it's not like the grand scheme of things in my life, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do agree with what you're saying in the sense of, and I probably didn't describe it or make it nuanced enough, but yeah, I don't think it's
Mm-hmm.
useless to do things that are
Yeah.
pleasurable, right? And
Right.
like you said, like many of them provide the space that you need to recover from doing work, or like allow yourself to be centered and grounded and whatever else. But yeah, I guess it was more like this angle of, for me at least, like if that's the only thing I was doing, like if I was only doing things that were pleasurable for the sake of being pleasurable, or for the sake of like
Mm-hmm.
being balanced and centered or relaxed or whatever else, then there
Yeah.
would still be this other part missing, where I don't feel like I could have like fully developed my happiness just
Mm.
focusing on sort of those like pleasurable aspects. I don't know if that lands any better,
No,
but
it does. Yeah, kind of where I was kind of going in my mind with that. Like, I think people can seek out pleasurable activities because they feel good, but that doesn't necessarily make you happy ultimately. Like, someone can go have sex every day or go get a massage every day, and they could still be deeply unhappy because maybe they're not having those other elements of, like, even if they're having sex every day, maybe they're not actually like emotionally or intimately connecting. They're just going through the motions of the physical activity, or if they're eating their favorite food every day, that's super pleasurable. Getting a massage every day, that's super pleasurable. But there's not that bigger thing driving them that's leading to happiness on a greater scale, kind of a thing. It's like temporary in the moment. It might give you like some happiness, but like once it's out, are you still happy or not? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it.
well, I think it's one of the most common, or at least from what I've seen in my life, traps that people sort of fall into, right? Like they're missing sort of this other connectedness piece,
Mhm.
or don't have the right tools or mindsets to be able to feel happy outside of pleasurable circumstances, and that sort of tricks them into thinking like, okay, well, if I just chase more of this,
Mhm. Right.
then I'll be happy more often, which in sort of one sense is technically true, in the sense of like, if you are um following these things all the time, like, yeah, a
Mhm.
higher percent of the time your brain will be occupied by things that it finds enjoyable. But there are ways to increase your happiness that are outside of sort
Mhm.
of focusing on things that are going to be pleasurable, and there's a lot more mileage to be made up there, just because
Mhm.
if you or often many of these pleasurable activities have potential downsides, or like if you overindulge in them, you hit a point of diminishing returns. Like, I'll
Mhm.
just stick with my same example of getting a massage. Like, one
Yeah.
of the reasons that it's so nice is
Mhm.
because it is something that I only have every once in a while.
Mhm.
I definitely feel like if I had one or like three every day, it would start to lose some of the appeal. Like, it would start to lose some of the
True.
benefit. I could
Sure.
be wrong. Could just be
I
like, wow,
don't
I feel the best I've ever felt in my life. This is incredible. But there are other ones that are, the line is a little bit more clear, like eating,
Yeah.
right? Like
Mhm.
a lot
Yeah.
of people, I've actually been in this boat multiple times in my life at different points, where just like I just keep eating because like I feel nice when I eat. Like, this stuff is
Yeah.
good,
Right.
but it doesn't resolve any of those root problems
Mhm.
around sort of this like lingering unhappiness that shows up whenever the pleasurable activities sort of fade out.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. The other thing that kind of popped into my head when we were thinking about pleasure is like I almost think of like a dopamine hit, like things that would give you a dopamine hit, like sex or a massage or certain foods. Particularly like the food I thought of was Oreos, because they have tested that on rodents and it raises their dopamine levels almost to the same degree as crack does, Actually, crack could be a pleasurable thing, but is that necessarily good for you? Not really. When you think of like the grand scheme of things, if you're eating Oreos all day, every day, yeah, it's gonna lead to negative health consequences ultimately, even though it's giving you that initial dopamine hit. You have to eventually deal with the other consequences that might actually lead to depression or other issues because of like weight gain and then being self-conscious, feeling like shameful. Those types of emotions could come up from that.
Yeah, definitely. Like the majority of those things are not able to produce long-lasting happiness in any reliable way. Now, at the same time, like like I mentioned before, I feel like it's almost impossible to have not almost impossible, very, very difficult to stay happy if you don't have any pleasure in your life, right? Like if you're just let's say you're working 90 hours every week to provide for your family, like that's a very purposeful, meaningful activity. Like it covers that bucket well, and that's how I think a number of people who have to do that sort of thing to survive and have their family survive are able to do it.
Right.
But at the same time, it's also not often a life that's super happy either, because the number of instances of pleasurable activities is so low
Right.
that it can be hard when, you sort of have quiet moments of reflection to look at your life and think like, oh, I'm like the happiest I could be. So anyway, that's why I keep going back to sort of like happiness seems to be a little bit more of a reflective state, or at least for like the way that I think about it is I only ever tend to think about or worry about my happiness if I'm reflecting, right? Like if I'm happy in the moment, I'm usually so consumed doing whatever the thing is that I'm not actually thinking about whether or not I'm happy.
Right.
And I feel like from my experience and what I've seen from other people I know is like often people are most unhappy when they are slowed down from everything and thinking about things, as opposed to um like they're in the middle of doing something that's taking their attention. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. The other avenue that I'd like to explore with you that I just thought of is like pleasure has also, it can go either way. Like pleasure is a good thing, but then there's the guilty pleasures. Like, ooh, it feels good, but you know it's bad for you, like the Oreos or other things potentially. Versus happiness. I'm like, nobody says guilty happiness. Like that would be interesting. But I'm curious what your take is on like guilty pleasures.
I think it is sort of in the same bucket of this trap that I talked about earlier that people commonly fall into of just chasing pleasure.
Yeah.
Now, when you say guilty pleasure, like you have more understanding of the relationship, I think, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to actually being fully stuck in whatever the trap is of like, oh, I'm just going to keep eating or chase these drugs or whatever else.
Right. Yeah.
You have awareness of like, this is potentially a trap. Like I'm sure you have done this, and I have done this many times, where
Yeah.
I'm watching something trashy on Netflix or whatever else, and then it's the weekend, and I look up and I'm like, it's 3 p.m. Like, what did I do today? I didn't do anything today, and the day's more than half over.
Yeah.
Or even later if I've really
That's
not
happened
done
too.
things correctly. But in some sense, it must have been pleasurable, because otherwise I wouldn't be drawn in enough to keep doing it. Like if it was very unpleasant and misaligned with my larger goals, it'd be very easy, very, very easy to be like, okay, I'm just going to stop watching this and do something else.
Yeah.
But I think those guilty pleasures, a lot of them fall into that sort of bucket of like, this provides a lot of pleasure, but if I think about it in the context of my greater goals, it's not the way that I should be using my time or acting or whatever else. So I think as long as there's some balance there around like, yes, Oreos are my guilty pleasure. I have 2 every couple days or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that seems reasonable. But yeah, I think it's just the more mindful version of sort of getting stuck in that trap.
Yeah, totally. I think it comes down to the frequency of it, and that, I think it's actually okay to engage in some guilty pleasures in moderation, being the key word, not like every day all day long can get out of hand. So eating the Oreos, if you can actually do that, just eat two and stop. That's impressive for one. And sometimes I can't, maybe not with the Oreos. It depends on how many are in the house, but like I can actually eat like 2 pieces of chocolate and stop and be like, okay, my urge is satisfied. I'm going to eat healthy for the rest of the day and then go about it. Versus like, yeah, if I eat chocolate all day long every day, that could lead to some problems. So I think it's not necessarily you should feel bad about eating the food. It's more about like how often or how frequently or how much are you doing that guilty pleasure? Because I think it's like, ooh, it's okay with in small quantities or small doses, but just kind of having that mindfulness and deciding what's the appropriate amount. So you can have the pleasure, but also still have the balance of the happiness or the bigger goals that you're seeking out of life.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this too, but I personally have found out how important it is to not go the other direction as well, which is to
Yeah.
never allow myself any of those things that could potentially fall in those buckets. I think that's how I worked my way into panic attacks and stuff, is because
Mm-hmm.
in the name of trying to be more efficient or to be like more in service of some of these bigger goals, I lost sight of balance of things. And
Mm-hmm.
so on the other end of it, I would have, these guilty pleasure things that I would never let myself do.
Mm-hmm.
Never. Like it would be like, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to work, or I'm not going to do this or whatever else. And in the same way I was talking earlier about, like, yeah, you can probably work like 80-90 hour weeks to support your family if you have to, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to be, it's very unlikely to be an awesome or like happy life.
Yeah, definitely.
Um Same sort of thing. Like it's a little, it's probably a little non-satisfactory to keep hearing this, but it is about balance. It's about finding sort of ways to introduce some pleasure
Mm-hmm.
and actually this is redundant, but like take pleasure in the pleasures
Yeah, totally.
without going so far that you have other negative consequences or whatever else. It's
Right.
just about like this mindful balance of,
Mm-hmm.
cool, some of these things sometimes are nice,
Mm-hmm.
but also I don't want to push them so far that I start facing other negative consequences. And
Yeah.
also, I don't want my life to be so derived of pleasure that I can't actually um, enjoy it, to some degree or another, because I'm so in the service of purpose or larger goals or whatever else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. And I kind of almost want to remove the word guilty from pleasure, because it brings about this idea of it's like it's bad, it's wrong, shouldn't be doing it, these guilty pleasures. But it's like, well, no, it's just more, have it on occasion, moderation, but in balance and of those greater goals and purposes. And I think that's the key word today, is balance between the two. Yeah.
Yeah. On another note, those guilty pleasures I feel like often have like a social component, right? They're often things that like people don't want to necessarily tell other people that they do all the time or enjoy or whatever else, which is
Right.
a whole interesting and maybe too long for today separate topic. But
Yeah.
I definitely, whenever I hear people saying that phrase specifically, like this is my guilty pleasure, usually the thing that follows is something that they are nervous they will face negative sort of like social repercussions for, of like, oh my god, your guilty pleasure is watching this show or this, or eating this thing all or whatever else. So
Yeah.
I do think that factors into it too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and I'm interested to hear what your take is, but I kind of associate like certain pleasures, if you do overdo it, like it can have like addictive qualities to it, like whether that's a binging on Netflix or the Oreos again, or sex, or those other guilty pleasures of like you're overdoing it. You're so hooked on like that dopamine high that it provides that that's where it leads to more of the shame versus And maybe for some people it's harder to control. It depends on each person's personality type. Maybe people have more addictive, although some things are designed to be addictive, like Netflix. Definitely, they just keep rolling into the next episode, and until like at a certain point it's like, are you still watching stuff? And then it makes you feel guilty for watching for so many hours. But versus like happiness, I'm like, what is that addictive? I don't see that association as deeply.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think because pleasure is more directly wired into your brain, it's a much easier trap to fall into. Now,
Yeah.
I will say with happiness stuff, some of it is a little more hard won, right? Because you can't do something like just ingest something and get a bunch of dopamine. Like there's not really an equivalent for happiness in sort of this like broader sense. But I will say there are definitely things that I've learned or worked on that are addictive in the sense that once I've figured them out, or like mindsets or whatever else, like once I have a grasp on them, I don't have any desire to like go backwards or any. It doesn't mean that I'm perfect.
Yeah.
But just for example, seeing how much happier I am, for example, when I give people the benefit of the doubt on stuff, right? Like we've talked about this many times, like getting cut off in traffic, whatever. Like the amount of happiness that I have gained from being able to be like, I don't know what's going on in their life and I don't know what they're doing today. And like, there's a million reasons that could have happened. And like, maybe that could be anyway. Those tools and things as I've developed them, like it's addictive. They're addictive in the sense that I would never want to go back to thinking the way that I did before because I got so much unnecessary pain that I could just completely skip and avoid. So it's definitely not addictive in the same way.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not something that I'm tempted to go back on, right? It's more like, oh, I catch myself not doing this thing. Cool. Immediately I'm gonna try to like use one of these other tools to get myself back into a better place.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking of activities that like bring happiness and balance to my life. And I'm like, I definitely don't think I'm addicted to it because it's easy for me to fall off the way. I was like, meditation, exercise. I'm like, yeah, I mean, do I get a high from it? Maybe a little bit of adrenaline high from exercise, but it's like, it's almost like part of my routine and patterns to create balance. And it's like, I can easily say no to a workout. I have to like mentally like get myself in the right mindset to go and be consistent. So yeah, it's a different kind of thing, I think.
Well, I think the other part that factors in there is most of those things that are in that sort of like good for you, but like sort of pleasurable bucket they're also effortful, right? Like eating a sandwich is not effortful. Watching Netflix is not effortful.
Yeah.
Like it's not hard.
Yeah.
So you never have to fight with yourself around like, do I want to produce the effort to do this? And I think that's one of the biggest differences is just, like, because I do think, I mean, I guess I don't know, but I feel like doing things like exercising or meditating can provide dopamine, but it's effort. So I think that's the big difference.
Right. Yeah, totally. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Was there any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and help spread the happiness in the world. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and then go and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when the next video comes out. And if you check out in the description below, go to my website where you can get my free fast and easy guide to stress relief. Thanks again for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.